Franconia, 1573. A 19-year-old man named Frantz Schmidt takes up a quill, opens a bound ledger, and writes a single entry that will outlive him by nearly half a millennium. He is beginning a diary. Listen to what he records. He does not write about the changing of the seasons. He does not write about the autumn harvest. He writes down the name of a condemned thief, the specifics of the crime, and the exact mechanical method by which Frantz took the man's life. Over the next 45 years, Frantz Schmidt will fill those pages with 394 executions. He will log them with the calm, steady hand of a merchant balancing his books, the rope, the wheel, the sword. And the worst part isn't the dark iron gall ink or the aging parchment or the staggering number of the dead. The worst part is the quiet, immaculate dignity of the handwriting. The worst part is the realization that to Frantz Schmidt this was not a theater of cruelty. It was a strict civic duty. It was a trade. Welcome to History for Sleepyheads. Tonight we are going to walk through the quiet cobblestone streets of the early modern world, past the bolted doors, past the dying embers of the hearths, to the edge of the town square. We are going to look closely at a figure who has been buried under centuries of cheap myths and lurid horror stories. The hooded monster, the bloodthirsty butcher, the nameless sadist swinging an axe in the dark. None of that is true. The real history of the medieval and early modern executioner is far stranger, far quieter, and infinitely more melancholy. He was a man the town could not live without, yet a man the town would not touch. His touch, by law and by custom, was considered a permanent spiritual stain. He lived his life entirely in the margins. He lived in a designated house outside the city walls. He drank from a separate chained cup at the local tavern. He married only the daughters of other executioners, binding his children to the exact same isolated fate. And yet, when the townspeople grew sick, when a bone was broken or an illness refused to pass, it was to the executioner's door they came in the dead of night, knocking softly, seeking medicine from the very hands that broke bodies by day. Tonight, we will explore the rigid rules of his dark guild. We will examine the tools of the office, looking closely at the heavy, flat-tipped steel of a Richtschwert, an executioner's sword, resting quietly in a glass museum case today. We will understand the terrible, precise weight of wielding it. We will listen for the single toll at the passing bell, echoing over the slate roofs. And we will explore the terrifying, quiet truth that governed the scaffold from Nuremberg to Paris. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. Lie back. Let your shoulders drop. Settle deep into the dark. The square is entirely empty now. The crowds have long since gone home. There is only history left to tell. Nuremberg, 1578. A man walks into a local tavern just as the sun dips below the slate roofs of the city. The air inside is thick with the heat of the hearth, the smell of roasted pork, and the low, steady hum of weavers and merchants finishing their day. But as this man crosses the threshold, a subtle, unmistakable shift occurs in the room. The voices do not stop entirely, but the laughter thins. Eyes carefully avert. Space is quietly, deliberately made as he walks toward the heavy oak counter. He approaches the tavern keeper. He does not ask for a drink, and the keeper does not offer a greeting. Instead, the keeper reaches beneath the counter and slides a very specific vessel across the scarred wood. It is a mug, but it is not like the others. It is chained to the wall. In some taverns across the Holy Roman Empire, the cup was not chained but kept on a high, separate shelf, entirely removed from the pewter and clay vessels the other patrons used. When the man finishes his ale, he pays his tab, but he does not hand the copper coins directly to the keeper. He drops them into a shallow bowl of vinegar, placed on the counter specifically for him. The vinegar purifies the money. The chain isolates the cup. The man is Frantz Schmidt, the master executioner of Nuremberg. And the worst part isn't the chained cup, or the bowl of vinegar, or the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. The worst part is the absolute, unquestioned legality of it all. Frantz Schmidt was the most necessary man in Nuremberg on the morning of a hanging, and the one man no honest citizen would ever touch. Both things were true at once. This is the central paradox of the executioner in the early modern world. To understand him, you have to completely unlearn the modern cinematic image of medieval justice. He was not a masked brute. He was not a rogue vigilante acting in the shadows of a dungeon. He was a highly trained civil servant. He was a professional employee of the state. He possessed a level of anatomical knowledge matched only by the finest physicians of his era. But he belonged to a rigid, distinct legal and social class in the German lands known as the unehrliche Leute, the dishonorable people. Dishonor in 16th century Europe was not a feeling, it was a legal status. It was a physical stain. It was something you could catch, like a fever, simply by brushing against the wrong person or sharing the wrong space. The unehrliche were those whose trades forced them to deal with the dead, the discarded, or the deeply shameful. The gravediggers were unehrliche. The skinners who stripped the hides from dead horses were unehrliche. The latrine cleaners who worked in the dark, hauling night soil away from the cobbled streets, were unehrliche. And at the absolute pinnacle of this dark hierarchy, wearing the heaviest, most inescapable cloak of dishonor, was the executioner.
Because of this legal stain, the executioner could not live among the people he served. His house was almost always located outside the city walls or pushed to the absolute margins of the town, nestled deliberately downwind. He lived beside the tanneries. He lived beside the knacker's yard. He lived near the leper colonies. You would smell his neighborhood long before you saw it. The sharp ammonia stench of curing hides, the slow, sluggish water of the drainage ditches, the rot of the bone pits. This was where the executioner ate his meals. This was where he mended his heavy woolen clothes. This was where he raised his children. He was kept entirely outside the walls, so the town inside the walls could remain pure. The town was a living, breathing body, and he was the necessary unclean hands that did its dirty work. The point was simple. The violence of justice was essential, but the man who enacted it had to absorb the moral pollution of the act. If he walked into the city market on a normal Tuesday, people crossed the street to avoid his shadow. If a baker handed him a loaf of bread directly, instead of placing it carefully on the counter for him to pick up, that baker could be accused of sharing in his dishonor. If the executioner accidentally brushed his heavy coat against a woman in the square, she might burn her dress. Yet the town could not function without him. Justice in the early modern period was deeply, fundamentally physical. A crime was not just a breach of the peace, it was a severe wound to the cosmic and social order.
The law required a physical, mathematical correction to set the universe right again. A town without an executioner was a town paralyzed. If a local magistrate passed a sentence of death or ordered a thief to be flogged but had no master headsman to carry it out, the court simply stopped. The criminal remained in the tower, eating the town's grain, while the cosmic debt remained unpaid. Small towns and villages that could not afford to keep a full-time executioner on their payroll had to borrow one from larger cities like Nuremberg, Frankfurt, or Bamberg. The town councils would send desperate formal letters begging for Frantz Schmidt's services. They would pay staggering daily rates. They would cover his travel, his lodging, the feed for his horse, and the wages for his assistants, all so he would ride through their gates and cleanse their town of a criminal. He was an incredibly valuable asset. The magistrates needed him. The mayor needed him. The law needed him. Imagine the terrible, isolating weight of that existence. You are summoned by the highest authorities in the land. You stand on the high wooden scaffold, the absolute center of attention, enacting the will of the emperor himself. For that single hour, you are the most powerful man in the city. You command the guards, you command the crowd. But when the work is done, when the rope is cut, or the sword is wiped clean, the authority evaporates. You walk home alone in the fading light, out the city gates, to a cold house outside the walls. You belong to the square now. You are an instrument of the state, but you are not a citizen of it.
This isolation bled into every single corner of his life. It dictated his prayers. When the executioner went to church on Sunday, he could not sit in the carved wooden pews with the rest of the congregation. He had to stand in the very back, behind a specific stone pillar, or sit in a designated, segregated pew, far from the altar. It dictated his death. When an executioner finally died, he was routinely denied burial in consecrated ground. He was buried outside the cemetery walls, or in a quiet, unmarked corner reserved solely for the dishonorable, alongside suicides and unbaptized infants. The grave was silent. The earth was cold. The priests looked away. But the most devastating consequence of the Unrecht status was what it did to his children. The stain of the executioner was hereditary. It was carried in the blood. A boy born to an executioner could not join the baker's guild. He could not apprentice with a silversmith or a blacksmith. He could not become a merchant or a tailor or a cobbler. No honorable guild in the Holy Roman Empire would accept the son of a headsman. The master craftsman would refuse to sign his papers, claiming his presence would pollute the entire workshop. And a daughter born to an executioner faced a similarly restricted fate. She could only ever marry the son of another executioner, or perhaps the son of a skinner. The bloodlines turned entirely inward. Over the centuries, they formed an isolated, nationwide web of executioner families, intermarrying across the German states. The Schmidts married the Mengers married the Deichens. They passed the heavy steel sword and the heavy social shame down from father to son, generation after generation. It was a trapped dynasty of blood. Frantz knew this exactly. He understood the profound weight of the stain from the day he was born. He did not choose this life. He inherited it, because his own father, Heinrich, had been forced into the role by a cruel prince years before. Heinrich had been a completely honorable woodsman until a local nobleman, needing a sudden executioner and finding none available, arbitrarily chose Heinrich from a crowd and commanded him to hang 3 men on the spot. By obeying, Heinrich saved his own life, but he permanently destroyed his family's honor. The woodsman became a headsman. The stain fell over the house. Frantz was trapped in the guild.
But Frantz was also an educated man. He was devout, he was exceptionally skilled, and he possessed an iron will. He spent his entire adult life fighting a quiet, desperate, bureaucratic war to escape the margins of society. He wrote formal letters, he petitioned the local magistrates, he built a reputation for absolute sobriety, medical skill, and unshakable morality. He wanted his honor restored. He wanted his sons to be free to choose their own lives, to walk into a tavern and drink from a normal cup. He wanted them to be able to touch the world without the world flinching away. It took him 45 years of flawless, methodical work on the scaffold to even approach this goal. 45 years of striking true. 45 years of raising the heavy, flat-tipped sword, bringing it down with perfect geometry, and wiping the steel clean. And through it all, as the years ticked by, he remained a man of deep, unsettling calm. He understood his place in the machinery of the city. Whenever you hear the single toll of the passing bell echoing over the rooftops, signaling the long walk to the scaffold, you are hearing a man simply going to work. He knew that the violence he enacted was not personal. It was a transaction. It was a civic necessity, carried out by hands that the city washed its own hands of. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. From today's view, this social isolation looks like profound, hypocritical cruelty, a society demanding violence while punishing the man who provides it. From their view, it was spiritual quarantine, a necessary firewall to keep the soul of the city clean. And that's what's so chilling.
Steinach, 1573. A 19-year-old boy named Frantz Schmidt, the son of a dishonored woodsman, takes up a pen, opens a bound paper ledger, and writes a single paragraph that will outlive him by 450 years. Listen to what he wrote. October 5th, 1573. Leonhard Russ of Cairn, a thief, executed with the rope at the instigation of the Margrave of Brandenburg. This was my first execution. He wrote it by the dim light of a tallow candle. He wrote it in a house situated far outside the protective walls of the town. He wrote it while the air in his room was still cold with the coming autumn. And the worst part isn't the dark iron gall ink, or the heavy paper, or the dead man named Leonhard. The worst part is the blank pages that follow. There were hundreds of blank pages waiting in that ledger, and over the next 45 years, Frantz Schmidt would fill almost every single one of them. This book, a plain, unassuming diary that somehow survived the centuries and sits safely in a climate-controlled archive today, is the most extraordinary first-person document of the early modern period. It is not a confession. It is not a memoir. It is a meticulous, chronological accounting of death. From the autumn of 1573 to the spring of 1618, Frantz Schmidt recorded 394 executions. He also recorded 345 corporal punishments, the floggings, the brandings, the severing of fingers and ears that made up the lesser machinery of medieval justice. To understand this object, you have to understand the physical reality of the man holding the pen. Imagine the sequence of his day. You would hear the single toll of the passing bell in the morning, echoing heavily over the slate roofs of Nuremberg, calling the town to the square. You would stand on the high wooden scaffold. You would do the heavy, muscular, terrifying work required of the office. And then, when the crowd dispersed and the sun went down, you would walk back out the city gates, alone. You would wash your hands in a basin of cold water.
You would sit at a small wooden desk. You would open the leather cover. You belonged to the square now, but here, in the quiet dark, Frantz belonged only to the ledger. The texture of the entries is what makes the diary so deeply unsettling. If you expect the boasting of a monster or the tortured apologies of a guilty conscience, you will not find them here. The voice in the diary is the voice of a merchant balancing his accounts. It is flat, it is spare, it is strictly procedural. Listen to another entry. June 18th, 1601. Anna, a serving maid, beheaded with the sword for murdering her infant. That is all. There are no adjectives describing the color of the sky. There is no commentary on the screaming of the crowd. There is no lingering on the terrible, wet sound of the strike. The crime is named. The method is named. The math is absolute.
The ink was black. The page was white. The work was done. This total absence of emotion is the most terrifying thing about the text. We want our executioners to be haunted. We want them to see ghosts in the corners of their rooms, to pace the floorboards, to tremble when they hold a knife to cut their evening bread. But Frantz Schmidt did not tremble. He slept soundly. He viewed himself not as a killer, but as an instrument of the law and an instrument of God. The flat, unfeeling language of the diary is the ultimate proof of the town's philosophy. The violence was just math. A debt was owed to the community, and Frantz merely collected it. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. Yet, if you read closely, if you comb through the hundreds of dry, administrative paragraphs, something remarkable happens. Tiny, almost imperceptible cracks begin to form in the ice. The strict cataloging voice falters just for a moment, and a deeply feeling, deeply conflicted human being leaks through the ink. These are the rare moments where Frantz Schmidt's personal judgment enters the historical record. He writes of a young boy, completely uneducated and led astray by older bandits who wept bitterly on the scaffold. He was a poor young creature, Frantz notes, stepping entirely outside his professional neutrality. In another entry, he records the execution of a man who was so terrified, so overcome by the animal panic of his impending death, that he fought the guards and had to be dragged screaming to the block. Frantz writes about this not with sadistic pleasure, but with a profound, heavy disappointment. To Frantz Schmidt, a chaotic execution was a disaster. It was a failure. Not just a professional one, but a spiritual one. In the mindset of the 16th century Lutheran, the scaffold was not just a place of punishment, it was a place of final salvation. If the condemned prisoner accepted their sentence, if they confessed their sins aloud to the crowd, forgave the executioner, and submitted to the blade without struggling, it was considered a good death. The town believed that a person who died a good death was instantly forgiven by God. Their soul went directly to heaven, their earthly debts entirely paid by their blood. But if the prisoner screamed, if they cursed the judges, if they fought the ropes, it meant the devil was fighting for their soul right there on the wooden planks. Frantz saw it as his highest, most sacred duty to help the condemned achieve that good death. He would pray with them in the holding cell. He would speak quietly to them as they climbed the stairs. He would try to calm the animal terror in their chests. When you read his diary, you begin to realize that the plain, flat entries are not a sign of a sociopath. They are the sign of a man desperately trying to keep a lid on the immense, crushing psychological weight of what he is asked to do. He cataloged the deaths so neatly because he needed the universe to be neat. He needed to believe that the system was righteous, that the law was just, and that his soul was entirely clean,
even as his hands were covered in the consequences.
The diary was also a weapon. Frantz did not write it for the public, but he did write it with a long-term audience in mind, the ruling authorities of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember the central paradox of his life. He was a master of his craft, universally respected for his skill, yet permanently stained as an outcast. He could not enter a guild. He could not drink from a shared cup. His sons were doomed to inherit the same bloody, isolated trade. Frantz hated this. He despised the unehrlich, the dishonorable status forced upon his family. And he decided, with the same methodical, unshakable patience that he brought to the block, that he was going to buy his family's honor back. He knew that the only way to escape the margins of society was to prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that he was the most respectable, pious, and disciplined man in Nuremberg. The diary was his proof. It was his immaculate record of service. If a magistrate ever questioned his sobriety, Frantz had the book. If the town council ever doubted his precision, Frantz had the book. He recorded the dates. He recorded the exact laws broken. He noted every time he managed to sever a head with a single, flawless strike of the sword, a feat that required immense physical strength and flawless geometry. The heavy, flat-tipped blade, which survives today in the glass cases of European museums, was an unforgiving tool. A millimeter of hesitation meant a botched strike, a screaming prisoner, and a rioting crowd. Frantz recorded his perfect strikes because they were proof of his absolute professional mastery. The leather was cured, the pages were thick, the ink was made from crushed oak galls and iron salts, meant to last forever. He built a paper monument to his own respectability, built out of the broken bodies of the condemned. By the time he was an old man, his hands beginning to shake with the arthritis of age, the diary had grown thick and heavy. He had outlived the magistrates who hired him. He had outlived the executioners in the neighboring towns. He had become an institution in Nuremberg, a quiet, solemn figure, dressed in heavy wool, walking through the snow from his house outside the walls. In 1618, after 45 years of service, he laid down the sword, he retired, and he closed the ledger. But his final, greatest act was still to come. Using the impeccable record of his life, supported by the very city council that had kept him at arm's length for decades, Frantz Schmidt sent a formal petition to the Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II. He asked for the restoration of his family's honor. And the emperor, looking at the lifetime of immaculate, devastating service, granted it. Frantz Schmidt died an honorable man. His sons were free to join the trades. The stain was washed away. But the book remained. The dark iron gall ink dried on the parchment, locking the 394 names into the permanent record of the earth. From today's view, this diary looks like the ledger of a serial killer, coldly cataloging his victims at candlelight. From their view, it was the ultimate accounting of a righteous, necessary civic order, kept by the most dutiful civil servant in the city. And that's what's so chilling. Regensburg, 1532. Emperor Charles V, the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, a man whose domain stretches from the cold coasts of the Netherlands to the sun-baked hills of Spain, takes up a heavy brass seal. He presses it firmly into a pool of hot red wax. He is ratifying a document that will outlive his empire by centuries. Listen to what it ordered. Whoever maliciously and willfully murders another, the same shall be judged and condemned to death by the sword. He stamped the wax, because there was no uniform justice in his lands.
The local lords were arbitrary, the local courts were chaotic, the punishments were entirely at the whim of the nobility. And the worst part isn't the list of ways to die contained within the pages he just signed. The worst part is the meticulous, suffocating, mechanical order of the margins. This document was the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina. It was the first body of criminal law to apply across the entire Holy Roman Empire. It was not a license to kill. It was the exact opposite. It was a vast, sprawling, desperate attempt to make killing lawful, measured, and slow. To understand the executioner, you must first understand the machine that built him. We are accustomed to thinking of the headsman as a lone predator, a terrifying figure acting on his own dark impulses, swinging an axe in the damp stones of a dungeon. But the reality was a bureaucracy. The executioner was merely the final obedient gear in a massive clockwork of parchment, ink, and law. The Constitutio Criminalis Carolina was a book. It was bound in thick calfskin, or sometimes heavy pigskin, tightly stretched over wooden boards. It was closed with brass clasps that clicked sharply in the quiet of the courtroom. The paper inside was thick and deeply textured, smelling of dust and binding glue. It sat on the heavy oak desks of magistrates from Frankfurt to Nuremberg to tiny remote alpine villages. And within its 219 articles, it established a complete, unbending grammar of punishment. Before 1532, a thief might be banished in one town and boiled alive in the next. The Carolina ended that. It mathematically matched the method of destruction to the nature of the crime. The code divided death into strict categories. There were honorable deaths and there were dishonorable deaths. Beheading by the sword was the honorable death. It was reserved for citizens, for crimes of passion, for straightforward murder without aggravating cruelty. It was considered clean because it did not degrade the body. The condemned knelt on the earth. The strike was swift. The blood watered the ground. But hanging was different. Hanging was the dishonorable death. It was reserved almost exclusively for thieves. The law viewed theft not just as a loss of property, but as a cowardly, base betrayal of the community trust. Therefore, the thief was not allowed to die on the ground. He was hoisted into the air. He was suspended between heaven and earth, rejected by both. And according to the strict rules of the Carolina, the body was not to be cut down. It was left for the crows. The rope was for the thief. The fire was for the heretic and the arsonist. The heavy wooden wheel, mounted horizontally on a tall post, was for the highwayman and the aggravated murderer. These were not arbitrary choices made by a bloodthirsty executioner on the morning of the event. They were preordained by the book. The law dictated the tools. The law dictated the ropes. The law dictated the exact trajectory of the blade. This strict adherence to procedure extended to the very concept of guilt. The Carolina demanded absolute certainty before a life could be taken. In the early modern mind, a false conviction was not just a tragic miscarriage of justice, it was a profound spiritual hazard. To execute an innocent man was to mock God and to invite the wrath of heaven upon the entire town. Therefore, the standards of evidence were incredibly, almost impossibly high. To condemn a person to death under the Carolina, the court needed either two unimpeachable eyewitnesses to the exact moment of the crime, or a full spoken confession from the accused. Because two eyewitnesses were rarely available for a murder committed in the dead of night, the confession became the absolute center of the legal universe. It was known as the Queen of Proofs. and because it was required, the law allowed the magistrates to extract it. This is where the grim machinery of the era is most visible. The court did not use physical pressure out of sadistic glee. They used it because Article 104 of the law book told them they had to, and it told them exactly how. It specified when a magistrate was allowed to apply pressure, how long it could last, and what questions could be asked. Everything was recorded. A clerk sat in the corner of the room, holding a quill, writing down every single word, every cry, every silence. The judge sat in a cushioned wooden chair. The clerk sat at a small desk. The executioner stood in the shadows, waiting for his instructions. This is the great, terrifying paradox of the executioner's life. He was the man the public despised. He was the man forced to live outside the city walls, the man whose coins were dropped into vinegar, the man shunned by the bakers and the weavers. And yet he was the only man in the entire chain of justice who possessed absolute zero authority over the violence. The executioner did not judge the accused. The executioner did not sentence the accused. He did not write the laws, and he did not interpret them. He simply received a piece of paper with a heavy wax seal. Imagine the scene in the town square on the morning of a sentence. You would hear the single toll of the passing bell echoing over the slate roofs, a slow metallic heartbeat cutting through the cold morning air. The procession would emerge from the town hall. The magistrate would stand on a raised wooden platform. He would unroll the parchment. He would read the crimes aloud to the silent, waiting crowd. He would cite the exact article of the Carolina that had been breached, and then he would physically break a small wooden wand over his knee, a ceremonial staff of office, and throw the two broken pieces at the feet of the condemned. It was a legal gesture, severing the prisoner from the community. You belong to the square now. You are no longer a citizen. You are a subject of the law.
Only then, after the wand was broken, after the clerk had recorded the exact time of day, after the magistrate had stepped back, did the executioner step forward. He was not acting on his own behalf. He was acting as the physical manifestation of Emperor Charles V's thick leather book. When Frantz Schmidt raised his sword in Nuremberg, he was not executing a personal vendetta. He was executing Article 137. He was a civil servant completing a bureaucratic task. Yet human psychology is a frail and illogical thing. The crowd watching in the square could not project their fear and their horror onto a leather-bound book in Regensburg. They could not project it onto the dignified magistrate standing in his velvet robes, because the magistrate represented the safety and order of the town. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone to carry the heavy, polluting weight of the actual physical death. So they placed it entirely on the executioner. They blamed the axe, not the hand that signed the warrant. The executioner absorbed the sins of the city so the city could sleep with a clean conscience. He was the ultimate scapegoat, designed by the system to take the fall for the system's violence. He knew that the man kneeling before him on the wooden planks was there because the magistrates had ordered it, because the clerk had written it, and because the law demanded it. He was just the final period at the end of a long bureaucratic sentence. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. The sheer administrative scale of it is what separates early modern justice from simple murder. The death was scheduled. The wages were negotiated in advance. The receipts for the rope, the nails, the wood for the scaffold, and the executioner's fee were all meticulously recorded in the town ledgers, sitting right next to the receipts for fixing the church roof or paving the market square. It was a civic utility.
It was infrastructure. When you look at the Carolina today, sitting quietly in a glass case, its pages yellowed and stiff, it does not look like a weapon. It looks like a tax ledger. It looks like a dry, dusty administrative text. But those carefully arranged paragraphs of ink killed thousands of people, efficiently, legally, and without a single trace of unauthorized malice. From today's view, this looks like state-sanctioned cruelty hiding behind the polite veneer of paperwork. From their view, it was a triumph of reason and order over the chaotic, bloody whims of local tyrants. And that's what's so chilling.
Nuremberg, 1589. A young woman named Margarita sits alone in a cold, damp stone cell beneath the town hall, eating a meal of roasted meat and sweet wine that she did not pay for. Above her, in a house outside the city walls, a man named Frantz Schmidt opens his ledger and writes a sentence that will outlast them both. Listen to what he wrote. Margarita, a serving maid, she repented her sins, wept bitterly, and died a good death by the sword. She wept because she was terrified. The guards standing outside her door were armed. The priests were already praying over her as if she were a ghost. The magistrates who had condemned her were waiting in the square. And the worst part isn't the cold stone, or the heavy wooden door, or the roasted meat she can barely swallow. The worst part is the quiet, devastating realization that the only person trying to comfort her is the man tasked with ending her life. For 3 chapters, we have stood in the shadows with the executioner. We have looked at his ledgers, his laws, and his isolation. Now we must turn the camera around. We must look at the person on the other side of the blade. To understand the machinery of medieval justice, you have to look at the human material it processed. Margarita was an armor sünder, a poor sinner. That was the legal and spiritual term for the condemned across the Holy Roman Empire. The law stripped away her name, her profession, and her history, reducing her entirely to this single, final identity. She was not a monster. She was a young, unmarried woman, deeply poor, completely alone, who had committed the tragically common, desperate crime of infanticide. She had been abandoned. She had hidden the pregnancy out of pure terror. She had buried the evidence. The Carolina demanded her death. The sentence had been read aloud. The wooden wand had been broken over the magistrate's knee. But in the early modern world, the moment the wand was broken, a profound and startling shift occurred. The town's hatred for the criminal evaporated. It was replaced instantly by a deep, terrifying religious reverence. Margarita was no longer an outcast. She was a human soul standing on the absolute precarious precipice of eternity. And every single ritual surrounding her final mourning was designed meticulously and carefully to keep that soul from falling into the hands of the devil. The execution was not meant to be a torture. It was meant to be a rescue. It began with the food, the Henkersmahlzeit, the hangman's meal. It was a lavish, heavy final feast provided by the city council or sometimes paid for by the executioner himself out of his own wages. The bread was fresh. The wine was the best the town cellars had to offer. The meat was rich, often roasted pork or beef, served on a clean pewter plate. The point was simple. Whatever earthly deprivations had led her to crime, whatever profound hunger she had known in her short life, it should be erased before she faced God. The meal was a final, physical comfort. It was the first small mercy of the day. When she finished eating, her clothes were taken away. She was dressed in an armesünder hemd, the poor sinner's shirt. It was a plain, unadorned garment made of rough white linen. It fastened at the front. It had a low collar, deliberately cut wide to expose the back of the neck. It was essentially a burial shroud worn by the living. She was already dressed for the grave. Then came the procession.
You would hear the single toll of the passing bell echoing over the slate roofs, a slow, metallic heartbeat cutting through the cold morning air. But this time it was not tolling for a nameless, abstract criminal. It was tolling for her. If she were too weak to walk, she would be placed in a wooden cart. As the cart rattled over the uneven cobblestones, moving slowly from the town hall to the execution ground outside the walls, the crowd did not jeer. The cinematic image of peasants throwing rotting vegetables at the condemned is largely a modern fiction. The crowd sang. They sang thick, slow, mournful Lutheran hymns. The priests walked beside the cart, holding a simple wooden crucifix directly in her line of sight, speaking to her in low, calming voices. They told her to look only at the cross. They told her not to look at the sky, or the buildings, or the faces of the people she used to know. When the cart finally stopped, she was led up the wooden steps of the scaffold. You belong to the square now. She stood at the center of the world, trembling in the cold wind, entirely alone. And then came the most astonishing, heartbreaking ritual of the entire era. Before she was made to kneel, Frantz Schmidt stepped forward. He did not wear a black hood. He did not hide his face. He walked up to her, dressed in his finest, most respectable clothes, a dark velvet doublet, a clean white collar. He looked her directly in the eyes. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders, and he formally, quietly asked for her forgiveness for what he was about to do. This was not a hollow theatrical gesture. It was an absolute spiritual necessity. The theology of the time dictated that if Margarita died with hatred or anger in her heart toward the executioner, her soul would be lost to hell. The devil fed on anger. But if she forgave him, if she looked at the man holding the sword and said the ritual words, "I forgive you as I hope God will forgive me," she was instantly redeemed. Her soul was wiped clean. The two most isolated people in the entire city, the untouchable headsman and the doomed woman, were bound together in this quiet, terrifying intimacy. They were the only two people on the wooden platform who fully, physically understood what the next 60 seconds would require. She had to offer him her forgiveness. He had to offer her his skill. This is the great hidden truth of the executioner's trade. When we think of these men, we think of cruelty. But to Frantz Schmidt, his greatest moral duty, his absolute highest act of Christian charity, was speed. A skilled executioner took deep, profound pride in delivering a clean, single stroke. A botched execution, where the blade slipped, where the condemned suffered, was a genuine catastrophe. It was a disgrace to the magistrates. It was a horrific, unthinkable torment to the prisoner. And it was incredibly dangerous for the executioner himself. A crowd witnessing a botched strike could, and sometimes did, riot, tear down the scaffold, and stone the headsman to death. The mercy of a single, flawless cut was the only thing standing between order and absolute chaos. So Frantz prepared meticulously. He made sure the heavy, flat-tipped sword was sharpened to a razor's edge. He did not use an axe because an axe is clumsy. A sword is precise. He guided her to the center of the platform. He placed a blindfold gently over her eyes so she would not see the flash of the steel. He spoke to her softly, adjusting her shoulders, making sure her posture was perfectly upright so she would not flinch or pull away at the final moment. He did not want her to suffer for a single fraction of a second longer than the law demanded. He was going to use every ounce of his strength and every year of his training to pull her out of the world without pain. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. The law was unbending, the system was cruel, the magistrates were uncompromising, but in the final, breathless second of her life, the man standing behind her was trying to be kind. The sword was raised, it caught the pale morning light. The strike was silent, perfectly geometric, and instantaneous. The heavy steel moved faster than human thought. One moment, Margaretha was praying in the dark behind the blindfold, whispering her final confession to the empty air, and the next, she was entirely free. She was free from the cold and the fear and the judgment of the magistrates. The executioner stepped back. He did not celebrate. He wiped the blade clean with a cloth, his face completely blank, his breathing steady. He had kept his promise. He had given her a good death. From today's view, this looks like a grotesque pantomime, murder dressed up in the comforting clothes of religious compassion. From their view, it was a profound, successful rescue of a human soul from the brink of hell, delivered by the only man brave enough to swing the steel. And that's what's so chilling.
Solingen, 1550. A master swordsmith in the most famous forging city in the Holy Roman Empire takes up a heavy iron hammer and a hardened steel chisel. He aligns the chisel against the flat, broad expanse of a newly cooled blade, and he strikes. He taps a single sentence into the metal that will outlast him by nearly 5 centuries. Listen to what he wrote. "When I raise this sword to strike, I wish the poor sinner eternal life." He engraved those words deeply into the steel, because this blade was never meant for a battlefield. It was never meant to parry another weapon or to be drawn in anger in a tavern brawl. The tip of the blade was entirely flat, rounded off like a heavy steel spatula. The crossguard was plain and perfectly straight. The handle was wrapped in tightly braided wire, long enough for 2 heavy hands to grip it comfortably. And the worst part isn't the weight of the steel or the dark wood of the hilt or the lack of a stabbing point. The worst part is the immaculate, flawless condition of the edge. This was the Richtschwert, the executioner's sword. To understand the physical reality of the executioner's life, you have to walk quietly through the tools of his office. Imagine a museum at night. The lights are dimmed, the crowds have gone home, the heavy oak doors are locked, the objects sit safely behind thick, climate-controlled glass, resting on beds of dark velvet. They are silent now, but in their time, they were the most feared and meticulously maintained objects in the city. If you look closely at the surviving Richtschwert resting in its case, you will see the exact nature of the work it was built to do. The blade was exceptionally wide, often 2.5 inches across, and forged to carry a heavy forward balance. The steel was cold, the edge was clean, the law was satisfied. It was built for a single, unobstructed, downward trajectory. It was designed to do exactly one thing, faster than the human nervous system could process. The sword was the instrument of the honorable death. Because it did not crush, because it did not strangle, because it theoretically required only a fraction of a second, it was the tool reserved for citizens and the repentant. But a tool is only as merciful as the hands that hold it and the condition in which it is kept. The scabbard was made of leather or heavy waxed canvas or sometimes sheepskin, oiled and oiled again until it looked by lamplight almost black. The point was simple. Whatever moisture was in the air, and the damp winters of the German states were heavy with it, it should not be able to reach the steel. The scabbard sealed the blade. It went down past the crossguard. It tied at the pommel. The interior was lined with fleece, holding natural lanolin against the metal. The exterior was reinforced by iron. The baldric was thick cowhide.
Frantz Schmidt would have spent countless quiet hours in his house outside the walls, sitting by the fire, holding a soft cloth and a small cup of oil, sliding it slowly down the flat of the metal. If the blade rusted, it dragged. If it dragged, the strike failed. A failed strike was the executioner's deepest, most terrifying professional shame. It meant agony for the condemned. It meant a riot in the square. The maintenance of the sword was not just a chore, it was a sacred, preventative ritual. He kept it sharper and cleaner than his own table knife. He wiped away the dust. He checked the leather grip. He ensured the crossguard was tight. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. It was just a piece of iron, pulled from the earth, heated in a forge, and shaped by a man trying to feed his family. Beside the sword in the museum, you will find the block. The block was made of oak or heavy ash, or sometimes a simple thick stump of local pine, sawed and sanded and sawed again until it sat on the wooden planks of the scaffold entirely level. The point was simple. Whatever the force of the blow, and the downward strike of a heavy two-handed sword carried immense, staggering force, the wood should not splinter or shift. The block anchored the strike. It sat low to the ground. It gripped the planks. The top was sometimes slightly scooped out to cradle the chest or the chin. The edges were smoothed. The base was heavy. There was nothing inherently evil about the block. It was just wood. The carpenter who built the town's wagons and repaired the church pews built the block. The ordinary, mundane carpentry of the execution ground is deeply unsettling. The gallows, standing tall at the edge of the town, were built with the same wooden pegs, the same joinery, and the same geometry as a local barn. From the heavy crossbeam of those gallows hung the rope. The rope was thick, woven hemp. It smelled of tar and dry flax. While the sword was the honorable tool, the rope was the ultimate symbol of the unairlish, the dishonorable. It was reserved for the thieves, the footpads, and the burglars. The mechanics were brutal and plain. Unlike the modern long drop method invented centuries later to break the neck instantly, the medieval and early modern hanging was a slow, agonizing suffocation by suspension. The executioner did not drop the condemned through a trapdoor. He pushed them from a ladder or hauled them upward. The rope was incredibly cheap. It was entirely effective. It required very little skill to maintain, only a dry place to store it so the hemp did not rot. When the single toll of the passing bell echoed over the city, calling the executioner to his work, he knew exactly which tool the Carolina required him to carry.
And for the worst offenses, for the highwaymen who murdered travelers in the dark forests, or the assassins who killed for coin, the law required the heaviest, most dreaded tool in the entire dark catalog, the breaking wheel. If you see a surviving wheel in a museum, it looks entirely unremarkable. It is not covered in spikes. It has no complex gears. It is simply a very large, very heavy wooden wagon wheel, rimmed with iron, with thick wooden spokes radiating from a central hub. It was an agricultural object, repurposed for the ultimate destruction of the human frame. The grammar of the law dictated its use. The condemned was staked to the ground. The executioner lifted the heavy wooden wheel, raised it above his head, and brought the iron rim down, methodically shattering the bones of the legs, the arms, and finally the chest. The ruined body was then threaded through the spokes of the wheel, and the entire apparatus was hoisted onto a tall wooden pole at the crossroads, left for the elements and the crows. It was a complete, deliberate, terrifying unmaking of the human form. But even here, in the absolute depths of the legal machinery, the executioner was required to remain calm. He did not swing the wheel in a frenzy.
He delivered the strikes exactly as the magistrate had ordered, counting them out, delivering the violence with the steady, measured pace of a blacksmith working a piece of cold iron. Then he put the wheel down. He washed his hands. He walked home. You belong to the square now. The tool stayed on the pole. The man went back to his ledger. This exact sword, the one forged in Solingen, the one with the prayer tapped into its flat steel, did not turn to dust. It was not melted down for scrap. It survived the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire. It survived the changing of the laws, the abolition of the death penalty, and the modern era. It sits quietly behind the glass today, its heavy iron grip entirely empty, its blade perfectly polished, waiting out the centuries in the dark. From today's view, this looks like a curated exhibition of psychopathy, a catalog of horrors built by sadists. From their view, it was a perfectly engineered toolkit of justice, maintained with the utmost respect, designed to balance the moral scales of the universe. And that's what's so chilling.
Nuremberg, 1590. A weaver wraps his young son in a heavy woolen blanket and steps out into the freezing, moonless night. The boy has fallen from a loft and shattered his collarbone. The father does not go to the university-trained physicians in the center of the city. He does not go to the apothecary. He walks toward the city gates, past the locked doors of the honorable guilds, past the tanneries, and up the quiet hill to the isolated house of the unehrlich. He knocks softly on the door of Frantz Schmidt. Listen to the staggering, documented numbers of this man's life. Over his 45-year career, Frantz Schmidt executed 394 people. But alongside that grim ledger, he acted as a physician, treating an estimated 15,000 individual medical patients. He saw them day and night. He saw the rich and the desperately poor. And the worst part isn't the shattered bone, or the freezing wind, or the dark walk out to the margins of the town. The worst part is the absolute, unhesitating trust the father places in the executioner's hands. The town had collectively decided this man was too unclean to sit beside in church. They dropped his coins into vinegar. They forced his children to marry within a closed, blood-stained caste. And yet, this exact same town, when its own children were broken, knew exactly whose door to knock on after dark. This is the single most surprising, counterintuitive truth of the early modern executioner. He was the closest thing to a trauma surgeon the 16th century possessed. To understand how the killer became the healer, you have to understand the immense, unbridgeable gap between academic theory and physical reality in the medieval medical world. The licensed physicians of the era did not touch their patients. They considered it beneath their dignity. A university-educated doctor in 1590 read the ancient Greek texts of Galen and Aristotle, usually in Latin. They diagnosed illness by looking at astrological charts, by studying the alignment of the planets, and by holding a glass flask of the patient's urine up to the candlelight to examine its color. If surgery was required, or if a bone needed to be set, the physician stood across the room and directed a lowly barber to do the actual cutting. The licensed doctor was a philosopher of the body. He was entirely disconnected from its physical mechanics. The executioner, by profound contrast, was an absolute master of human anatomy. His knowledge was not theoretical, it was deeply, violently tactile. The executioner knew exactly how the muscles of the back were layered because he had to know where to apply the lash. He knew exactly how much mechanical tension a human joint could endure before it dislocated on the rack.
and because he knew exactly how a shoulder was pulled out of its socket, he was the only man in the city who knew exactly how to gently, firmly, and safely maneuver it back in.
The point was simple. He knew how to fix the human body because the state paid him to break it. When the sun went down, the executioner's home transformed into a crowded, quiet clinic. The splints were made of smooth willow wood. The bandages were boiled linen, washed entirely clean of blood. The salves were rendered animal fat, crushed comfrey root, and chamomile, ground in a heavy stone mortar and pestle until they formed a thick, soothing paste. The executioner cleaned wounds. He amputated crushed fingers. He set fractured femurs and bound broken ribs. He possessed a practical, hands-on understanding of infection and bone alignment that was centuries ahead of the academic physicians. But the executioner's medical practice also contained a much darker, stranger economy. It was known as gallows medicine, and it was driven by the deep, unshakable superstitions of the era. In the early modern mind, the body of a condemned criminal who died a sudden, violent death was believed to retain all of its unspent life force. Because the prisoner had not died of a wasting disease, their vitality was thought to be trapped in their physical remains. The executioner, as the sole legal custodian of the dead, became the gatekeeper to this macabre pharmacy. The most valuable commodity was Menschenfett, human fat. The fat of the poor sinner was carefully rendered down by the executioner and sold in small ceramic jars. It was highly prized as a potent ointment for treating severe joint pain, arthritis, and gout. The blood of a freshly beheaded criminal caught in a cup right at the scaffold was widely believed to be the only true cure for epilepsy. People would pay the executioner a premium for these materials. Skulls were cleaned and ground into powder to treat migraines. The rope used for hanging was cut into small pieces and sold as a good luck charm to gamblers and pregnant women. We instinctively recoil from this. We see it as ghoulish exploitation. But you have to view it through the lens of their world. To the people of Nuremberg, this was not horror. It was the cutting edge of sympathetic magic. It was the sincere belief that the universe provided a cure for every ailment, and that the profound spiritual debt of a criminal's death could be transformed into a physical blessing for the sick. The executioner provided the materials, plainly, calmly, as a recognized medical supplier. This immense, lucrative medical practice infuriated the licensed physicians. The doctors' guilds across the Holy Roman Empire constantly petitioned the town councils, demanding that the executioners be banned from practicing medicine. They argued that it was an insult to the university establishment for a dishonorable, blood-stained outcast to heal the sick. They filed formal complaints. They cited ancient laws. And almost universally, the town magistrates ignored the physicians. They ignored the petitions because the town magistrates themselves, the wealthy merchants, and the city councilmen were all secretly slipping out of their manor houses at night to be treated by the executioner. When a magistrate fell from his horse and shattered his leg, he did not want a doctor reading an astrological chart. He wanted Frantz Schmidt. The town protected the executioner's medical practice because the town desperately needed it.
For Schmidt, this healing work was not just a way to make extra coin. It was the central redeeming pillar of his life. He took his medical duties incredibly seriously. He was frequently appointed by the court as a forensic medical examiner, tasked with inspecting the wounds of assault victims to determine if they were lethal. He kept meticulous records of his patients, and in a trade defined by state-sanctioned cruelty, His medical practice was a quiet, continuous rebellion. It was a venue for documented, profound empathy. This is where we see the first true seeds of a strange, unexpected grace. Frantz Schmidt charged the wealthy merchants for his bone setting, often earning more from his clinic than he did from his executions. But historical records indicate that he frequently treated the poorest citizens of Nuremberg entirely for free. When the starving, the desperate, and the abandoned came to his door outside the walls, he did not turn them away. He bound their wounds, he set their bones. He offered them the immense, comforting weight of a skilled, gentle touch. It was a small, quiet mercy in a violently unforgiving world. Imagine the profound psychological dissonance of his days. You would hear the single toll of the passing bell in the morning. He would put on his heavy coat, walk to the center of the city, and act as the terrifying, unfeeling instrument of the law. He would break the wheel. He would raise the sword. By day, he is the state. You belong to the square now. But when the bell is silent, when the sun drops below the horizon and the cold sets in, the square empties, the machinery of justice shuts down, and in the quiet dark, the hands that ended lives were meticulously, tenderly saving them. When he set a child's broken arm, his touch was incredibly steady. The hands that killed were the exact same hands that healed. The paradox resolves perfectly when you realize that the violence was a requirement, but the healing was a choice. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. The blade was simply the law, carried out by a craftsman. The gentle, calloused fingers wrapping linen around a fractured wrist, that was the man himself. From today's view, this looks like a grotesque hypocrisy, a society forcing its killer to moonlight as its doctor. From their view, it was the perfectly logical, deeply pragmatic use of the most anatomically skilled hands in the city. And that's what's so chilling.
Nuremberg, 1588. A city clerk in a heavy woolen cloak sits at a wooden desk inside the town hall, opens a bound ledger, and carefully copies out a formal, legally binding schedule of tariffs. It is a price list. Listen to what he recorded. For a beheading with the sword, 4 gulden. For a hanging, 5 gulden, on account of the extra labor required to haul the body upward. For the flogging of a thief, 1 gulden and 15 kreuzer. He wrote it with the same steady, bored handwriting he used to record the price of winter wheat and the taxes on imported wool. He drew the columns with a wooden ruler. The ink was black, the math was simple, the ledger was full. And the worst part isn't the price placed on a human life. The worst part is the completely ordinary, administrative tone of the receipt. If you strip away the black hood of the myth and you strip away the religious terror of the scaffold, what remains is a business. The office of the executioner was a municipal trade. It was a livelihood, invoiced and audited like any other service in the city. To understand the rhythm of his life, you have to let go of the drama and look at the economics. This is the quietest, flattest truth of the early modern justice system. The executioner was paid by the piece. The fee schedule was known as the Taxordnung, and every major city in the Holy Roman Empire had one. It functioned exactly like the menu in a tavern or the price list in a blacksmith's forge. The more physically demanding or time-consuming the execution, the higher the fee. Hanging paid more than beheading because it required the executioner to manually haul the condemned up the ladder, secure the rope, and manage the heavy physical drop. Burning at the stake paid even more, often 7 or 8 gulden, because the executioner had to purchase the wood, stack the pyre, and stand for hours in the stifling heat to ensure the sentence was fully carried out. But executions alone were not enough to feed a family. In a typical orderly year in a medium-sized German town, there might be only 2 or 3 executions. There were long stretches of quiet. There were weeks and months where the sword stayed wrapped in its oiled leather scabbard. So the executioner relied on a base retainer. The city council provided him with a steady, baseline salary simply to keep him exclusively available. They provided the house outside the city walls, entirely rent-free. They provided an annual allowance of rye and barley. The town even exempted him from municipal taxes. And to supplement this, the executioner was granted a monopoly on the other unehrlich, the dishonorable, civic tasks of the town. This was the bundle of duties that kept the city functioning, but which no honorable citizen would touch. The executioner was often legally in charge of the knacker's yard. He was responsible for the disposal of the town's animal carcasses. When a horse broke its leg or a stray dog died in the street, the executioner or his assistants removed it. He stripped the hide, cured the leather, and sold it. In many towns, the executioner was also the chief inspector of the lepers and the overseer of the latrine cleaners who worked in the dark to empty the city's cesspits.
The point was simple. The executioner was the ultimate manager of the town's physical and moral waste. When you picture his life, do not picture a man standing constantly on a blood-stained wooden platform. Picture a man doing paperwork. Picture a man managing a small, highly specialized waste disposal business. Picture him sitting at his desk by the fire, calculating the cost of a new cart for hauling the animal hides, or counting the silver coins he earned from setting a weaver's broken collarbone the night before. When an execution did occur, the payment was handled with the same staggering bureaucratic distance. Imagine the afternoon following a morning on the scaffold. The crowd has gone. The square is empty. Frantz Schmidt washes his hands in a basin of cold water. He changes out of his formal velvet doublet and puts on a plain woolen coat. He walks up the hill to the town hall. He does not go to the main entrance. He goes to the side door, to the office of the municipal bursar. He submits his verbal invoice. The clerk opens the heavy, brass-bound town ledger. The clerk records the cost of the scaffold wood. The clerk records the cost of the iron nails. The clerk records the fee for the priest and the fee for the tavern keeper who provided the final meal. And then the clerk pays the executioner. But remember the absolute rigid isolation of his social class. The clerk does not hand the 4 gulden to Frantz Schmidt directly. To touch the executioner's hand, even in a financial transaction, would be to invite the legal stain of dishonor. Instead, the clerk reaches beneath his desk. He pulls out the shallow ceramic bowl filled with sharp-smelling vinegar. He counts the silver coins, one by one, and drops them into the liquid. They clink softly against the bottom. The vinegar purifies the money. The executioner waits for the clerk to step back. Then he reaches into the bowl, retrieves his wages, dries them on a piece of cloth, and walks out the door. It is perfectly silent. It is perfectly polite. It is devastatingly lonely. To earn these coins, a man had to possess an incredible degree of specialized skill. You could not simply pick up a heavy, flat-tipped sword and expect to cleanly sever a human spine. It required years of meticulous, grueling apprenticeship. Because the executioner's trade was a closed caste, a father trained his sons. The training began when the boy was 10 or 12 years old. He did not begin with human subjects. He began in the garden behind the house, outside the walls. The father would place pumpkins or large heads of cabbage on a wooden stump.
The boy would be given a wooden training sword, weighted with lead to match the exact heft of the true steel. He would strike the cabbages over and over until he could hit the exact same millimeter of wood every single time without varying his angle. When he mastered the vegetables, he moved to animal carcasses. He learned to cut through the thick muscle and heavy vertebrae of sheep and calves. He learned how bone resisted steel. He learned how to plant his feet, how to breathe, and how to carry the momentum of the swing entirely through the target.
By the time a young man reached his late teens, he would embark on his Wanderjahre, his journeyman years. Just like a baker or a silversmith, an apprentice executioner would leave his home city and travel across the Holy Roman Empire, carrying a letter of introduction from his father. He would seek work as an assistant under other master executioners in other towns. He would learn how the wheel was constructed in Frankfurt. He would learn how the gallows were tied in Munich. This vast, interconnected network of executioner families meant that a highly skilled headsman was a heavily recruited asset. If a town's executioner died, or if a small village suddenly needed to carry out a capital sentence, they would write desperate formal letters to Nuremberg or Bamberg asking to rent their man. Frantz Schmidt traveled frequently. He would pack his saddlebags. He would wrap his sword in oiled canvas. He would ride out of the city gates, a solitary contractor on a business trip. When he arrived in the new town, he was given the finest room in the local inn, though he was required to eat his meals alone in his room, away from the other guests. He would negotiate his travel expenses. He would inspect the local scaffold. He would perform the work. And then he would ride home, carrying a signed receipt in his saddlebag. You belonged to the square now. But it was not just one square. He belonged to every square that could afford his daily rate. This is where the quiet, terrifying ordinariness of the office truly settles in. When you hear the single toll of the passing bell echoing very softly from a neighboring village, carried faintly on the wind, you are not hearing the sound of a monster. You are hearing the sound of a tradesman clocking in for a shift. There was no malice in the transaction. If you hired a carpenter to build a table, the carpenter did not hate the wood. If you hired a headsman to carry out the law, the headsman did not hate the condemned. The death was a line item in a municipal ledger, slotted neatly between the cost of paving a road and the cost of replacing the lead on the church roof. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. It is just an invoice. From today's view, this bureaucratic approach to death looks incredibly cold, a chilling system that reduced the end of a human life to a handful of coins dropped in a bowl of vinegar. From their view, it was the only way to keep the violence contained, professional, and entirely subordinate to the rational order of the state. And that's what's so chilling.
Hoff, 1553. A completely ordinary forester named Heinrich Schmidt is walking through the smoke-choked streets of his hometown. The city is under siege. Margrave Albert Alcibiades, a notoriously volatile and violent prince of the Holy Roman Empire, has just taken control of the territory. The Margrave has captured 3 men he suspects of plotting against his regime, and he wishes to see them hanged immediately. But in the chaos of the military occupation, he has no executioner in his retinue. He looks at the terrified crowd of citizens gathered in the square. He points a heavy, leather-gloved finger at Heinrich. Listen to what the prince ordered. "Take the rope and hang these men, or I will hang you beside them." He took the rope. He climbed the wooden planks. He dropped the men. And the worst part isn't the 3 dead bodies, or the suddenness of the violence, or the sheer terror pounding in the forester's chest.
The worst part is the invisible permanent stain that fell over his unborn children the exact second the rope went taut. Because Heinrich Schmidt performed the duties of an executioner, he legally became one. He was instantly, irrevocably stripped of his honor. And by the rigid, unbending laws of the unehrlich, the dishonorable, that stain did not stop with his own hands. It infected his blood. To understand the deepest, quietest tragedy of this history, you must look at the children. We instinctively picture the executioner as a solitary, brooding figure, a man who chose a dark and violent path because of some flaw in his own character. But in almost every case across the early modern period, this was not a man who took up the blade. This was a boy who was born holding it. He was a child who would one day hand it to a son who never had a choice either. If a boy was born in the house outside the city walls, his life was completely decided before he took his first breath. When he grew old enough to work, he could not walk into the center of town and ask to sweep the floors of the baker's shop. The bakers would turn him away. If he touched the tools in the silversmith's forge, the guild would demand the tools be destroyed, terrified that the spiritual pollution of his bloodline would infect their silver. The Weavers' Guild would refuse to sign his apprenticeship papers. He inherited the chained cup at the tavern. He inherited the bowl of vinegar for his coins. He inherited the marked, isolated seat at the very back of the church. You belong to the square now. From the moment he could walk, the town told him exactly what he was. Because the honorable world inside the walls was completely sealed off to them, the executioner families turned entirely inward. They built a shadow society. A headsman in Nuremberg whose son had come of age would write a carefully worded letter to a headsman in Bamberg or Frankfurt or Leipzig, asking if he had a daughter of marriageable age. The families intermarried across the German states, across France, and across the whole of Europe. The Schmidts married the Wohlweiders married the Mengs. They created massive, sprawling, aristocratic dynasties of death. The weddings of these families were beautiful, and they were devastatingly lonely. The townspeople did not attend. The local magistrates did not send gifts. The guests were simply other executioners, traveling quietly from neighboring provinces, gathering in the house outside the walls to watch two young people bind themselves to the only life they were legally permitted to live. The most famous of these closed dynasties was the Sanson family of France. For 6 generations, across nearly 2 centuries of French history, a single bloodline held the high office of Monsieur de Paris, the chief executioner of the capital. The dynasty began in 1684 with a man named Charles Sanson. It passed seamlessly to his son, Charles Jean-Baptiste. It passed to his son, Charles-Henri Sanson, the man who would eventually drop the heavy angled blade of the guillotine on King Louis XVI. And it continued all the way to 1847, ending only when Clément-Henri Sanson was formally dismissed for pawning the state's guillotine to pay off his staggering gambling debts. Kings rose and fell. Empires collapsed and rebuilt themselves. Revolutions burned the city to the ground. And through it all, the Sanson family remained in their house, sharpening the steel. The cruelty of this system was its utter blank indifference to the nature of the child. What if the son of an executioner was faint of heart? What if he was gentle or squeamish, or simply wanted to be a botanist or a musician or a clerk? It did not matter. The machinery of the state required a mechanic. The system did not care about the boy's soul. It only cared about his blood. When Charles-Henri Sanson was a young boy in the mid-18th century, he desperately wanted to be a doctor. His family managed to enroll him in a quiet convent school in Rouen, hoping to give him a normal education. They hid his true identity. For a few years, he was simply a student. But eventually, the father of another boy recognized him. The school administration panicked. They forced Charles-Henri to leave, stating plainly that the son of the executioner could not sit in the same room as the sons of honorable merchants. Shortly after his expulsion, his father suffered a severe stroke. Charles-Henri was forced to drop out of life entirely. At the age of 15, weeping quietly, he put on the heavy coat, climbed the steps of the scaffold, and took up the sword to support his family. He did not want to be there. The state did not care. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. The law did not hate the children of the executioner. It simply trapped them, efficiently and without a single drop of malice, in a permanent bureaucratic quarantine. Imagine the quiet, crushing sadness of the executioner's household on a normal evening. The father comes home from the square. He wipes the oil from his hands. He sits by the hearth. He listens to the single toll of the passing bell, fading into the night. He looks at his young son playing on the floor with wooden blocks, and he knows that he is the one who condemned this boy. He knows that his own work, the very work that puts bread and roasted meat on their table, is the exact thing that ensures his son will never be treated as a human being. This deep inherited sorrow is the true reason Frantz Schmidt kept his diary.
Remember Frantz, the boy from Steinach, who filled his ledger with 394 deaths? He was the son of Heinrich, the forester forced into the trade by the cruel Margrave. Frantz inherited the stain. He did not want to be an executioner. He was a deeply pious, intelligent, highly capable man who considered himself a physician. But he was trapped by the rope his father had been forced to tie. So Frantz made a monumental, lifelong decision. He decided he would use the trade to escape the trade. He decided he would be so perfect, so mathematically flawless, so relentlessly and undeniably respectable that the town would be forced to look at him as an honorable man. He spent 45 years living a life of absolute, unbending sobriety. He never drank in the taverns. He healed the sick in the dead of night. He never botched a single strike on the scaffold. And he recorded every single execution in his plain, flat ledger, building an immovable, undeniable mountain of paperwork to prove his civic worth. In 1618, his hands beginning to shake with age, Frantz Schmidt laid down the sword. He retired. But his true life's work was only just beginning. He hired lawyers. He drew up a massive formal petition to Emperor Ferdinand II. He submitted his decades of ledgers, his letters of recommendation from the Nuremberg City Council, and the testimonials of the thousands of desperate people he had healed. He asked the emperor for one thing. He did not ask for a pension. He did not ask for a larger house. He asked the emperor to issue a mandate washing the stain from his family's name. He asked for his honor back. And in 1624, after decades of waiting, the emperor answered. Ferdinand II stamped his heavy wax seal on a document that formally, legally restored the honor of the Schmidt family. He declared that Franz's descendants were entirely free. They were no longer unehrlich. The mandate was read aloud in the city. The invisible walls came down. The stain was finally completely gone. Frantz Schmidt died 10 years later, an old and deeply respected man.
He was not buried in the unmarked, dishonorable dirt outside the walls. He was buried in the prominent, highly sought-after St. John's Cemetery in Nuremberg, resting quietly in consecrated ground alongside the most respected merchants and politicians of the city. His sons did not inherit the sword. They went to the universities. They became highly successful physicians. They became honorable men. They walked into the taverns at the center of the city, and they drank from the exact same unchained cups as everyone else. The money they spent was placed directly into the hands of the merchants. The father had bought them back. He had bought their freedom with 45 years of flawless, agonizing, bloody work. He had taken the generational curse placed upon his own father, and he had broken it, quietly and completely, through the sheer force of his own immaculate dignity. From today's view, this inherited caste system looks like a generational nightmare, a society punishing innocent children for the necessary work of their fathers. From their view, it was the tragic but essential containment of a moral pollutant, safely locked away until it was finally lifted by the grace of an emperor. And that's what's so chilling.
Rome, 1810. A man named Giovanni Battista Bugatti, draped in a heavy scarlet-red cloak, stands near the bridge of Sant'Angelo in the early morning mist. He reaches into the pocket of his coat and pulls out a small, worn object. Over the course of his staggering 68-year career, working as the official executioner for the Papal States, Bugatti will log 516 executions. He will outlast 6 popes. He will become such an institution in Rome that the citizens will simply call him Mastro Tita, Master Justice. And the worst part isn't the number, or the scarlet cloak, or the damp fog rolling off the Tiber River. The most startling part is what he holds in his hand as the condemned prisoner is brought forward. It is a small silver snuff box. In 8 chapters, we have walked through the dark, unyielding machinery of early modern justice. We have looked at the ledgers, the laws, the isolated families, and the heavy iron tools. But as the night deepens, and as the square grows entirely quiet, we must look at the light that managed to survive inside the dark. No system built by human beings is ever entirely devoid of humanity. Even in the absolute center of the state's cruelty, there were cracks, and through those cracks, a quiet, desperate, astonishing tenderness sometimes leaked through. Tonight, we will look at 3 small mercies, 3 moments where the rigid grammar of death paused just for a second to allow for a final act of grace. The first mercy is the snuff of Mastro Tita. When a condemned prisoner was led to the scaffold in the Papal States, the terror was absolute. It was an animal panic that seized the chest and froze the lungs. The priests would be chanting in Latin. The crowd would be murmuring. The executioner, a massive figure in a red cloak, would be standing by the block. But before the final procedures began, before the prisoner was forced to kneel on the rough wooden planks, Bugatti would step forward. He would not speak of the law. He would not offer a religious sermon. He would open the small silver box, hold it out, and politely offer the condemned a pinch of tobacco. The box was silver, or sometimes simple polished wood, rubbed smooth at the corners from decades of use. The point was simple. Whatever the suffocating terror of eternity was made of, it could not completely erase the physical sensations of the present moment. The snuff grounded the prisoner. The prisoner would reach out with trembling fingers. They would take the dark, finely ground tobacco. They would draw it into their nose, and then, inevitably, they would sneeze.
The tobacco was sharp. The sneeze was sudden. The tension was broken. In that tiny, absurd, profoundly human second, the condemned man was not a symbol of sin. He was not a legal obligation. He was just a man standing in the morning air, having a pinch of snuff with another man. It was a gesture of absolute radical equality on a platform designed to strip equality away. It brought the prisoner back into their own body, offering them one last normal earthly sensation before the infinite dark. Mastro Tita did not have to do this. There was no papal decree demanding he share his tobacco. He did it because he had watched hundreds of men die, and he knew that the greatest comfort you could offer a terrified soul was a momentary return to the ordinary. The box was closed, the red cloak was adjusted, the work resumed, but the mercy had been given. The second mercy is invisible because to modernize it looks exactly like violence. It is the mercy of the clean stroke. We must return to the German states, to the quiet ledgers of Frantz Schmidt in Nuremberg. As we discussed earlier, Schmidt was obsessed with his own skill. But this obsession was not driven by ego. It was driven by a deep, profound, desperately held professional creed. In the mind of a master executioner, the single kindest thing one human being could do for another, once the sentence was passed, was to eliminate the variable of time. If a magistrate condemned a person to die, the death itself was inevitable. The executioner had zero power to grant a pardon or change the law. The only thing he controlled was the duration of the pain. A botched execution was the nightmare of the era. If an untrained or drunken executioner struck a glancing blow, or if his sword was dull, the prisoner suffered unspeakable agony. The crowd would scream. The priests would fall to their knees in horror. The spiritual transit of the soul would be interrupted by pure mechanical failure. Therefore, the hours Frantz Schmidt spent in his garden, swinging the heavy Richtschwert at wooden posts and animal bones, were not hours of bloodlust, they were hours of applied empathy. When Schmidt stood on the scaffold, he measured the distance with the exact calculating eye of a master carpenter. He checked the footing on the wooden planks, he checked the wind, he checked the angle of the prisoner's neck. He ensured the flat-tipped blade was oiled so it would encounter absolutely zero friction as it moved through the air. The stance was wide, the grip was tight, the breath was held. The speed and precision of a master headsman was the ultimate expression of care. He brought the heavy steel down so fast and with such flawless geometric perfection that the nervous system of the condemned simply ceased to exist before it could register the pain. It was a violent act completely scrubbed of malice. It was pure physics delivered as a rescue. When Schmidt recorded a flawless strike in his diary, he was not boasting, he was breathing a heavy sigh of relief. He had successfully shepherded another soul across the threshold without adding a single ounce of unnecessary suffering to their ledger. He had kept his promise to the city, and he had kept his promise to God. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. It is not an instrument of torture in the hands of a master. It is a key turning in a lock, opening a door instantly so the prisoner does not have to stand trembling in the hallway. The third and final mercy is the most beautiful and the most devastating of all the customs of the scaffold. It is the ritual of the armor sinner, the poor sinner, and the exchange of forgiveness. Imagine the scene at the very end of the long morning. You would hear the single toll of the passing bell echoing very faintly now, a slow, gentle heartbeat marking the final seconds. The cart has arrived at the execution ground outside the walls. The crowd has formed a massive, silent ring around the wooden platform. The cold wind pulls at the linen of the poor sinner's shirt. The condemned prisoner climbs the wooden steps. They are exhausted. The long night in the cell, the heavy final meal, the slow procession through the cobbled streets. It has all drained the fight from their bones. They stand at the center of the wood. You belong to the square now. But in this final minute, the phrase loses its cruelty. It becomes almost a comfort. The prisoner no longer belongs to the magistrates, or to the guards, or to the angry citizens they may have wronged. They belong only to the quiet air, and to the man standing beside them. Before the blindfold is tied, before the prisoner is asked to kneel, the executioner sets his tools aside. His hands are entirely empty. He steps forward. He removes his hat, exposing his head to the cold sky. He bows deeply to the condemned, and he speaks. The executioner, the untouchable outcast, the man whose shadow polluted the marketplace, formally asks the prisoner to forgive him for the act he is about to perform. This was the absolute emotional peak of early modern justice. The two most despised, isolated, and legally stained people in the entire Holy Roman Empire were locked in a quiet conversation that the magistrates and the wealthy merchants could not touch. The executioner was asking for spiritual absolution. He was asking the prisoner to acknowledge that the violence was not personal, that he was merely the final, tragic instrument of a law neither of them had written. And the prisoner, standing on the absolute edge of the abyss, would look at the executioner. They would see the heavy wool coat. They would see the steady, calloused hands. They would see a man trapped by his own bloodline, just as they were trapped by their own sentence. And the prisoner would speak, "I forgive you." The words were spoken softly. The debt was cleared. The spiritual ledger was balanced. In that single, fleeting exchange, the executioner washed the prisoner's soul clean of hatred, and the prisoner washed the executioner's hands clean of murder. They released each other. The town had rejected them both, but in the final minute of life, they offered each other the deepest, most profound grace their religion possessed.
The forgiveness was asked, the pardon was given, the peace was complete. It was a small, quiet island of humanity floating in a massive sea of state-sanctioned destruction. It proved that even when the law required a life, the people carrying out the law could still recognize the sacred, irreplaceable weight of the human being standing in front of them. The snuff box, the clean edge, the spoken pardon, they were tiny, fragile things, but in the dark of the early modern world, they were enough. From today's view, this looks like psychological torture masquerading as kindness, a series of empty rituals designed to make the killers feel better about the killing. From their view, it was the absolute triumph of Christian charity over the bleak, mechanical violence of the state. And that's what's so chilling.
Nuremberg, 1634. An old man named Frantz Schmidt, his hands finally and permanently free from the heavy, flat-tipped steel he carried for half a century, closes his eyes for the last time. He dies quietly in his own bed, inside a warm, well-built house surrounded by his grown children. He is 80 years old. Listen to what the municipal records tell us about his end. He does not die an outcast. He does not die a monster. He dies a fully reinstated, legally recognized, and profoundly respected citizen of the Holy Roman Empire. And the worst part isn't the passing of the years, or the fading of the ink on his final testament, or the slow stopping of his heart in the quiet room. The worst part is the realization of what this ordinary, peaceful death actually cost him. It cost him 45 years of flawless, agonizing, bloody work.
It cost him 394 lives. To understand the end of the executioner's story, we have to look closely at where the town finally allowed this man to rest. For centuries, the men who held his office were denied the basic, fundamental dignity of a Christian burial. When an executioner died, his body was carried out into the dark. He was buried outside the city walls, in the unhallowed, unblessed dirt reserved for suicides, for vagrants, and for the deeply dishonorable. There was no marker, there was no stone, there was only the quiet, permanent erasure of the earth. But Frantz Schmidt was not buried in the dark. Because of his decades-long, relentless bureaucratic campaign to restore his family's name, and because Emperor Ferdinand II had formally lifted the unehrlich stain a decade earlier, Frantz was granted a burial in St. John's Cemetery, Johannisfriedhof. It was the most prestigious, sought-after resting place in all of Nuremberg. Imagine the slow, solemn procession on the day of his funeral. The coffin was carried through the streets in the daylight. The priests walked ahead of it. The citizens of Nuremberg, the weavers, the silversmiths, the merchants who would once have crossed the street to avoid his shadow, stood and watched the procession pass. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, it was placed shoulder to shoulder with the most honorable men in the city. Frantz was buried alongside master craftsmen. He was buried alongside wealthy politicians. He was buried near the great artist Albrecht Dürer. A heavy, flat stone was placed over his grave. A bronze epitaph was fixed to the stone, bearing his name, his dates, and his title. The stone was cold. The letters were carved deep. The honor was permanently restored. And as the earth settled over Frantz Schmidt, a much larger, much slower settling began to take place across the rest of the world. The office of the executioner did not vanish overnight. It did not end with a sudden dramatic revolution or a single stroke of a pen. It faded slowly and almost imperceptibly as the centuries turned, and the world gradually changed its mind about the necessity of the public scaffold.
If you trace the history forward from 1634, you can watch the machinery of the Carolina slowly dismantle itself. As the Enlightenment dawned across Europe in the 18th century, philosophers and legal scholars began to question the brutal mathematics of medieval justice. In 1764, an Italian philosopher named Cesare Beccaria published a small, fiercely argued treatise called On Crimes and Punishments. It swept across the continent. Beccaria argued that the certainty of punishment, not its severity, was what deterred crime. He argued against the use of judicial torture. He argued against the death penalty itself. And very slowly, the magistrates and the kings began to listen. One by one, the darker instruments of the law were dragged out of the squares and locked away. The breaking wheel, that most dreaded of all early modern punishments, the agricultural tool repurposed for the unmaking of the human frame, was abolished. It was quietly removed from the legal codes of Prussia, of Bavaria, of Austria. The stake and the fire were extinguished. The branding irons were left to rust in the corners of the town halls. The point was simple. The state still required justice, but it no longer required the destruction of the body to be a theatrical, public lesson. The executioner's trade was stripped of its spectacle. By the 19th century, the high wooden platforms in the center of the town squares were torn down. The executions were moved. They were taken away from the open air, away from the eyes of the crowd, and relocated to the hidden, shadowed, enclosed courtyards of the state prisons. The executioner was no longer a towering, visible figure in a velvet doublet commanding the attention of thousands. He became a quiet, private technician in a plain woolen suit, arriving at a prison before dawn, pulling a lever,
and leaving by a side door before the sun came up. And as the public spectacle vanished, the rigid, suffocating social quarantine of the executioner slowly unraveled with it. The un-Ehrlich status, the legal stain of dishonor, lost its power as the ancient craft guilds lost theirs. The Industrial Revolution arrived, the cities expanded, the old, deeply superstitious beliefs about spiritual pollution through physical touch faded into folklore. The executioner's children were no longer barred from the schools. They were no longer forced to marry only the sons and daughters of other headsmen. The massive, sprawling, aristocratic dynasties of death, the closed loops of the Sansons and the Schmidts, finally broke apart and dissolved into the general population. The sons became clerks. The daughters married merchants. The long, generational nightmare of inherited shame quietly evaporated. But the objects remained. The physical residue of the trade did not turn to dust. If you walk through the cities of Europe today, you will find that the places and the tools still remember. Imagine walking into the German National Museum in Nuremberg, or the Medieval Crime Museum in Rottenburg ob der Tauber in the dead of night. The lights are dimmed. The air is heavily filtered and perfectly climate-controlled. The crowds of tourists who shuffle past these objects by day, taking quick photographs without truly understanding what they are looking at, are gone. The long galleries are completely silent. And there, resting on a bed of dark, faded velvet, behind a thick pane of security glass, is the Richtschwert.
It is a real executioner's sword. It is the exact tool we examined earlier. The blade is astonishingly broad. The tip is perfectly blunt and rounded. The brass crossguard is straight and unadorned. If you look very closely at the surface of the steel, you can still see the faint, intricate engravings etched into the metal by the master smiths of Solingen or Passau. The wheel, the gallows, the quiet religious motto wishing the poor sinner eternal life. The sword is terrifying in its stillness. It requires no maintenance now. It requires no oiling. The hands that gripped the heavy leather hilt, the hands that calculated the angle of the wind and the distance to the block, have been gone for nearly 400 years. But the iron remains. The steel is a physical memory of the law. It sits there, an inanimate piece of metal that once balanced the moral scales of a city, and now serves only as a silent, beautifully crafted artifact of a world we have completely left behind. It is the surviving object of our long night walk. It has outlived every magistrate who ordered it raised, every executioner who swung it, and every poor sinner who knelt beneath it. And alongside the iron, there is the paper. Frantz Schmidt's diary did not disappear when he died. The thick, leather-bound ledger, filled with the flat, emotionless records of his 394 executions, was preserved. It was passed down through his newly honorable family. It was copied by historians. It was eventually published, translated, and printed in modern books, completely exposing the secret, private rhythm of his life to a future he could never have possibly imagined. When you look at the original pages, the reality of his existence strikes you with physical force. You can see the dark iron gal ink. You can see how his handwriting changes over the decades. In the early pages, from the autumn of 1573, the bold, tight, careful handwriting of a terrified 19-year-old boy, desperate to prove his competence to his father and the magistrates. In the middle pages, it is the steady, flowing, rapid script of a master tradesman at the absolute height of his profession. And in the final pages, right before he closes the book in 1618, the handwriting begins to falter. The letters shake. The ink spots. You can see the arthritis in his fingers. You can see the sheer accumulated physical and psychological exhaustion of 45 years of killing.
The ledger remembers the names: Margarita, the serving maid; Leonhard, the thief. Hundreds of men and women who would have been completely, totally erased from the history of the earth if the man who took their lives had not painstakingly written their names down by candlelight. The paper is the greatest paradox of his legacy. The executioner was their destroyer, but through his meticulous record-keeping, he accidentally became their sole memorializer. The sword and the book, the iron and the ink, these are the things we are left with. And finally, there are the squares. Walk through the center of any major historic European city tonight. Walk through the Hauptmarkt in Nuremberg. The cobblestones are cold beneath your boots. The Gothic spire of the church reaches up into the dark, cloudless sky. The bakeries are closed. The taverns have bolted their heavy wooden doors. The space is completely, profoundly empty.
This is the exact space where the wooden planks were laid. This is the exact space where the crowd gathered, shivering in the dawn mist, waiting for the procession. This is the space where the single toll of the passing bell would finally stop ringing. But listen closely now. The bell is silent. There is no magistrate reading from a thick leather book. There is no clerk breaking a wooden wand over his knee. There is no hooded cart rattling over the stones. The long, dark machinery of the early modern law has been completely dismantled, packed away, and consigned to the archives. The town no longer requires a scapegoat to absorb its sins. The executioner's house outside the walls has crumbled. The tanneries and the knackers' yards have been paved over by modern roads and apartment blocks. The rigid, terrifying boundary between the honorable citizens inside the walls and the dishonorable outcasts outside the walls has vanished into the modern air. We started this journey trying to understand a monster, and we end it sitting quietly beside a tradesman. We end it recognizing that the cruelty of the past was not an accident. It was an engineered system built by deeply frightened people who believed that violence was the only way to keep the universe from tearing itself apart. The executioner was the man forced to carry the weight of that belief. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. It was never about hate. It was always about the terrible, unyielding demand for order. But now the order has changed. The executioner's shift is finally over. The burden has been lifted from his shoulders. He does not have to wipe the steel clean. He does not have to count the coins in a bowl of vinegar. He does not have to look his son in the eyes and apologize for the inheritance of the rope. You no longer belong to the square. The square keeps its silence. The history is settled. The night walk is done. We can leave the stones to their rest, and we can finally allow the story to close. From today's view, this history looks like a fever dream of a past we have entirely outgrown, a brutal and alien era where the executioner was both pariah and physician, a killer and a captive. From their view, it was the reality of their daily existence, a necessary, tragic, and solemn service that kept their fragile world from falling into chaos. And that's what's so chilling.
Nuremberg, Germany. The year is 2026. Deep inside the sprawling modernist architecture of the Germanisches Nationalmuseum, the heavy main doors have been locked for the night. The crowds of tourists, the school groups, and the visiting scholars have all gone home. The ambient lights in the long exhibition halls automatically dim to a soft, protective glow. The air in the room is strictly climate-controlled, kept at a constant, unvarying temperature. The humidity is meticulously filtered and stabilized. And there, resting quietly behind a thick pane of perfectly clear, shatterproof security glass, is a sword. It is a Richtschwert. It is 400 years old. The steel is cold. The wire wrapping on the long two-handed hilt is slightly oxidized but completely intact. The blade is exceptionally broad, beautifully forged, and deliberately completely flat at the tip. The point was simple. A pointed sword was a weapon of war, designed for the unpredictable, chaotic violence of a battlefield. This sword was not a weapon of war. It was a perfectly engineered instrument of civic administration. It was built to do exactly one thing with maximum gravity and minimum friction. If you lean very close to the glass, you can still see the faint, delicate engravings tapped into the flat of the metal by a master smith in the 16th century. An engraving of a wheel, an engraving of a gallows, a short, silent prayer asking for mercy on the soul of the poor sinner. The blade does not hate you. That is the hardest part. When you look at this heavy piece of iron resting on its museum mount, that truth lands with absolute physical weight. The sword is entirely neutral. It holds no malice. It holds no anger. It never did. It was just a piece of earth, heated in a forge, sharpened on a stone, and swung by a man who was simply trying to balance the terrible mathematical ledgers of his city. It sits behind the glass now, completely scrubbed of its dark purpose, resting in the 21st century as a quiet work of art. Not far away, in the temperature-controlled vaults of the state archives, another object sits in the dark. It is a book. The cover is heavy leather. The pages are thick, handmade paper. The ink, made from crushed oak galls and iron salts, has oxidized over 4 centuries from a stark, wet black to a soft, rusty brown. This is the diary of Frantz Schmidt. You do not have to be an archivist to read it today. Because of the meticulous work of modern historians, his private ledger has been translated, bound in paperback, and shipped across the globe. You can walk into a brightly lit bookstore in London or New York or Tokyo, and you can buy the private, innermost thoughts of the master executioner of Nuremberg. The irony of this survival is the most beautiful, quietly devastating part of the entire history. 400 years ago, the city of Nuremberg decided that Frantz Schmidt was too unclean to sit beside. The bakers would not hand him bread. The tavern keepers chained his cup to the wall. The city clerks forced him to drop his hard-earned wages into a bowl of sharp-smelling vinegar, terrified that the spiritual stain of his hands would infect their silver coins. He was an outcast, forced to live outside the walls, walking home in the cold dark while the honorable citizens locked their doors against him.
The magistrates are gone. The city clerks are gone. The priests who refused to look him in the eye are entirely forgotten, their names lost to the slow, uncaring grind of time. But the outcast survived. His sword is preserved under glass. His words are read by thousands of strangers who treat his memory with the deep, quiet respect he spent his entire life begging his own neighbors to show him. The town that shunned him is now a city that proudly curates him. The people who visit the museum do not drop their admissions fees into a bowl of vinegar. They pay willingly, eagerly, to step for just a moment into his world. For 45 years, the rigid laws of the Holy Roman Empire told him every single morning, "You belong to the square now." But he does not belong to the square anymore.
The wooden scaffold was torn down centuries ago. The cobblestones have been replaced. The tanneries and the bone pits outside the old city walls have been swallowed up by quiet neighborhoods and green parks. He is entirely released from his grim civic duty. He belongs to history now. He belongs to the quiet. If you close your eyes and listen to the air in your own room tonight, you will notice what is missing. The night is perfectly still. You will not hear the heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs. You will not hear the murmuring of the anxious crowd. And most importantly, you will not hear the single toll of the passing bell. The bell has stopped ringing. The long, terrifying machinery of the early modern law has powered down permanently and gone to sleep. We have walked a long way together tonight. We have walked past the bolted doors, through the cold morning mist, and into the strange, deeply human heart of a trade we were taught to fear. We found a monster in the shadows, and when we held up the lantern, we found only a man, doing the best he could with the heavy steel he was handed. From today's view, this history is a dark, incredibly heavy burden that we have thankfully, finally laid down. From their view, it was a desperate, necessary attempt to keep a fragile world from breaking apart, carried on the shoulders of a man who walked alone in the dark so the city could sleep in the light. And that is what is so profoundly human. The square is empty. The ledger is closed. The night walk is over. Sleep well.